The day had been a ruin, not in the sense of a romantic heap of stones, but in the sense of a complex system undergoing a cascading failure of its primary logic gates. Captain Kylara paced the floorboards of the bridge with the relentless, algorithmic precision of a hardware clock. Her reptilian tail, an appendage that served as both a vestigial rudder and a high-mast pendulum, struck the metal deck with a rhythmic finality that evoked the image of a headsman's axe in a particularly grim historical simulation. She moved through the dim, emergence-level lighting like the ghost of her own hierarchical authority, her mind a high-velocity churn of bureaucratic bile and the sort of high-stakes damage control usually reserved for planetary-scale fiscal collapses. 7 souls are being cast, with a statistical randomness of weighted dice, onto the surface of a Class 2 death world, a classification indicating a biome where the local thermodynamics were actively hostile to anything possessing a central nervous system. Among them were 3 specimens of the human tribe, their soft, carbon-based lives currently dangling over a metaphorical abyss that was rapidly becoming a literal one. Humans were, in the grand, multimillennial ledger of the Stellar Concord, a garish novelty, a species characterized by pink and brown fragility and a peculiar cognitive architecture that allowed them to be simultaneously brilliant and exceptionally stupid. Through some bizarre alchemy of cross-species charm and sheer, unadulterated luck, they had become the flavor of the month in the galactic court. They were handled like fine porcelain or high-yield explosives. This vessel was only the third to suffer the logistical overhead of their presence, and for Kylara, the loss of even one would be a permanent stain on her record, a dark, non-erasable ink blot that would consume her career trajectory and leave her name to rot in the cold, digital archives of failed officers. The how of the situation remained a jagged splinter in her consciousness. Why, a pirate fleet, specifically the Cathar, a culture whose entire technological aesthetic was based on jagged prows and the chemical scent of scorched iron, had been lurking at the extreme lip of the known universe was a question for a future intelligence briefing. The Explorational Unit, a group optimized for the quiet, passive ticking of sensors rather than the high-decibel thunder of kinetic weaponry, had been forced into a panicked, non-linear retreat. They had fled like startled birds from a shotgun blast, leaving their kin to the tender mercies of a planet whose primary ecological function seemed to be the systematic termination of life. She sighed, a dry, rattling sound produced by her respiratory vents, and listened to the silence. With a heart that felt like it had been replaced by a leaden ballast, Kylara drifted toward the bridge's central hub. In this hour of system-wide extremity, the crew stood revealed in all their monstrous, phenotypic diversity. R7 was a floating, vacuum-sealed madhouse containing 27 distinct species, which represented a mere rounding error when compared to the 300-plus civilizations comprising the sprawling, labyrinthine Concord. It was a logistical nightmare of the highest order to keep such a biological menagerie alive. The ship was a patchwork quilt of artificial microclimates and highly specific atmospheric mixes. The crew of Triton 12, an aquatic unit characterized by gills and high-viscosity slime, would have found this vessel to be a lethal desert. Here, on R7, the air was a stale cocktail of dry parchment and recycled breath. Beneath a canopy of sensory organs, stalked eyes, lidless orbs, multifaceted arrays, and auditory receptors of every conceivable leathery description, Kylara initiated the data transfer of their collective failure. The personal translators hummed at every throat, performing the real-time linguistic gymnastics required to turn her grim pronouncements into a multi-channel cacophony of alien sorrow. As the names of the missing were read into the record, the various species seemed to undergo a physical deflation, their silhouettes becoming heavy and mournful against the flickering, low-power consoles. The Auraels were notably absent, having retreated to their lead-line quarters to escape the psychic reek of so much concentrated, high-bandwidth despair. Being telepaths, the raw emotional output of the crew was, to them, a physical assault, a tide of hot, viscous grease. It was left to Kylara to deploy the final nail in the coffin, a linguistic artifact of human origin that she found peculiarly apt for this specific funeral of expectations. "We are currently in a state of tactical withdrawal," she said, her voice a thin, vibrating wire. "Sliding away from the planet at roughly 50% of the maximum velocity permitted by a warped universe. To arrest this momentum would require a deceleration window of approximately 4 months. Even if that were a viable trajectory, I cannot offer the remainder of this crew as a sacrifice to the Cathar without a significant wall of military-grade iron at our backs." We are crawling toward the nearest supply station for repairs, awaiting the slow, grinding gears of the Concord's military-industrial complex to turn in our favor. The FTL drive was, in the grand span of cosmic time, a toddler's toy, a mere 3 centuries old. It had done very little to advance civilization beyond allowing various species to kill one another at much greater distances, effectively pushing the Concorde into an era of frantic, breathless discovery fueled by a fear of missing out. Before its advent, the stars were distant, theoretical constructs reached only by those willing to undergo a several hundred-year nap in the frozen, liquid nitrogen wombs of hibernation pods. Humans had arrived on the scene with the secret of the drive already clutched in their greasy hands, a feat of reverse engineering or sheer persistence that bought them an entry-level membership into the Concorde's inner sanctum. But the drive was a crude, binary thing. It could hurl a ship forward with the violence of a medieval catapult, but it possessed no capacity for grace, no capacity for turning, and a very limited capacity for stopping once the physics of the warp took over. Jax, a human engineer, a creature whose physical form was a collection of sharp angles and skin permanently stained with high-pressure lubricants, shattered the heavy silence. He began asking for technical specifications regarding equipment and the planet's predatory hierarchy. As Kylara provided the data, she watched the humans. To her profound bewilderment, they did not exhibit the expected symptoms of biological collapse. Instead, a strange, terrifyingly focused calm settled over them, their facial features smoothing out like the surface of a pond after the splash of a stone. The other aliens, meanwhile, spiraled into a fever of speculative terror, running simulations of all the ways the planet would dissolve their soft tissues, save for the Pyra, who simply became a motionless statue of cold, gray stone. "She will boil," whispered the Pyra, the words falling with the acoustic finality of lead coins on the stone floor. The mate of a lost soul, he stared into the middle distance at a point of infinite sorrow. A hush fell over the bridge, thick as soot. Only the humans remained active, whispering in corners like high-level conspirators, their voices a dry rustle of parchment, until Jack stepped forward into the pale, flickering light of the command deck. "Captain," he said, and his voice held a jarring, metallic ring that suggested he was already thinking in terms of torque and tensile strength. "We might have a hack for the pirate situation, a way to throw them a lifeline across the black." Before Kylara could process the request, the other human groaned, burying his face in hands that shook with the kind of hidden palsy one sees in people who spend too much time working with unshielded reactors. "Must we? Do you actually remember the first line of the after-action report for this specific brand of madness? The ink wasn't even dry before the actuarial tables were updated with the body count. Would you prefer the permanent silence of the grave?" Jack snapped, his tone suggesting he had little patience for risk aversion. Kylara leaned forward, her reptilian eyes narrowing into vertical slits. "Engineer Jax, speak. What is this ghost protocol you wish to summon?" Jack stood tall, a crooked grin spreading across his face, a grin that seemed to mock the very laws of thermodynamics. "The Icarus Protocol," he said, his eyes alight with a frantic, feverish glow that was either brilliant or symptomatic of major psychotic break. Later, in the subterranean bowels of the technical room, amidst the constant, low-frequency hum of sleeping engines, Kylara watched the archival footage. Her throat felt tight, as if she were attempting to swallow a cup of dry sand. It was a historical account of the Versus Argus, a relic from the early, move fast and break things era of human space exploration. They had accidentally left a crew member behind in a low-rent shuttle, with approximately 6 days of breathable atmosphere remaining. Their FTL drive was a primitive, steampunk beast. It would have taken 10 days just to bleed off the kinetic energy required to turn around. It was a mathematical death sentence. Their solution was a nightmare of applied physics. They had effectively hollowed out their own ship, turning its central axis into a mag rail, a long, dark vacuum tunnel of linear acceleration. They strapped a drive to a supply pod and let it run within the belly of the mothership, using a series of local warps to reset its position to the start of the rail over and over, building up velocity until the pod was screaming with stored kinetic energy. Then, they spat it out into the void at a full, unassisted FTL velocity. Warping a grain of sand was a trivial exercise in mass displacement. Warping a vessel the size of the R7 even a single centimeter would turn it into a cold, dark husk of dead metal. The video was a montage of screaming structural alloys and space-time shivering under the intolerable strain of the maneuver. Small suns of static and Cherenkov radiation exploded on the screen. And yet, the pod had reached its target coordinates. Kylara turned to the head engineer, her voice a ghost of its former self. Is this within the realm of possible engineering? Xylos, his face a frozen mask of chitinous plates, seemed to vibrate with a terror that his biology was not equipped to express. There were no muscles in his face to twitch, yet the atmosphere around him felt as brittle as dry glass. Every logic gate in my consciousness is screaming that this is a descent into pure, unadulterated madness, he rasped. But if the barbarians manage it with vacuum tubes and hope, I suspect we can manage it with actual technology. Jax clapped a hand onto the engineer's shoulder, his fingers digging into the hard shell with a casual disregard for personal space. He grinned again, that same terrifying, wide-eyed look. It'll be a grand old time. Let's start the structural carving. While Kylara drafted her frantic, high-priority dispatches to the Concord, the ship transformed into a hive of frantic, violent industry. The xenobiologists, pale and trembling, debated which specific scraps of technology might keep the derelict alive for a few more days in a high-gravity, high-toxin environment. The humans remained the most vexing variable in the equation. Given double the allocated space for their supplies, a political bribe designed to keep the new species from complaining to the High Council, they treated the opportunity with a strange, nonchalant arrogance that bordered on the sociopathic. They were asked for a prioritized list of what was essential for human survival. They left the first rank, the critical survival category, entirely empty, as if they had no biological needs at all. In the second rank, they requested a simple folding knife and a scrap of paper. For the third, they asked for a data slate, a solar battery, and some packets of bioscript and nutrient gel. It was an insignificant payload, a handful of dust in the vastness of the shuttle's cargo bay. Kylara pleaded with them to take more, but they only watched the grieving pyro with eyes that were suddenly, hauntingly deep. Others need to wait, they said with a shrug. We'll make do with the dirt. Consequently, the shuttle was packed with the elaborate, power-hungry life support machines of the other species, while the human corner remained a hollow, echoing vacuum. 2 days of high-tension engineering followed, a period during which the very hull of the ship seemed to groan under the sheer conceptual weight of the Icarus Protocol. Kylara, remembering the human's cryptic warning, sought out the conclusion of the ancient video file. She saw a man on the screen, his face a topological map of exhaustion and reckless glee. He looked into the camera with that specific glint, the light of the truly damned or the truly divine. He spoke, his voice a gravelly rasp of compressed air. This is Versus Argos. Welcome to chaos. Down on the surface, beneath a sky the color of a badly bruised plum, Commander Thorne was wrestling with the inherent absurdity of his command. Dr. Vesper and the intern Orion were currently engaged in a shrill academic debate over the ethics of trying to coax a local multilimb monstrosity into a containment cage. Then came the signal. The R7 was breaking orbit. Thorne ran, his boots thudding against the toxic, spongy soil with a sound like a wet drum, Volok slung over one shoulder like a sack of biological grain, and Lyssa coiled tightly around his thoracic cavity. They reached the clearing just in time to watch the shuttle's ion trail fading into the gray, smog-choked clouds. They sat among the wreckage of their long-term survival prospects. Lyssa, the Aurael, struggled to weave a psychic veil over her consciousness, attempting to shut out the jagged, high-frequency thoughts of the others. Orion and Thorne were the only islands of stability in a sea of psychic noise. She began to preen her tail, her feathers a chaotic mess of mud and sweat, her movements jerky and mechanical, like a malfunctioning automaton. Thorne was a pillar of salt, or perhaps a statue of stoicism. He watched the horizon with a steady, unblinking gaze, his mind already running subroutines for building fortifications and digging trenches. Orion, the poor, blundering boy, seemed significantly more concerned with the Scylla looming behind him, a creature characterized by too many legs and a silhouette like a geometric nightmare, than with the fact that they were ghosts on a dead world. Lyssa found a thin, bitter thread of humor in the situation. The human feared the spider thing more than the vacuum of space. She began to glide toward the Scylla, her scale producing a dry, rasping sound against the rock. Thorne was staring at the drone's feed, a flickering window into a landscape of gray rock and sharp, high-contrast shadows. Lissa hissed, a sharp, sibilant sound that cut through the low-frequency wind like a razor. "We are currently in a state of isolation," Thorn said, his voice devoid of any rhetorical ornament. "The R7 has vanished into the warp. It will be a significant period of time before they find the logistical road back to us." Lissa hissed again, a sound of profound telepathic disagreement. "Damn it," Thorn muttered. He was a man of kinetic action, not of linguistics. "But look," he continued, waving a hand at the crates. The pilot had a professional grace to dump his entire inventory before he burned for orbit. "We have tools. 12 kilometers from here is a cave, a geological anomaly where the wind can't reach us. We move now, or we conclude our narratives in the dark." They began to pile the crates onto the grav-sleds, the machines humming with a low, sullen vibration as they fought the planet's significant gravitational well. They were clumsy pieces of hardware, pushing against the ground with invisible, shivering hands of electromagnetic force. The sixth sled were filled to the physical brink. Grolak, a mountain of fur and muscle that looked like a bear reborn in a particularly dark fairy tale, moved with a slow, tectonic heavy-handedness. He was their primary beast of burden, a giant among the small, scurrying figures of the rest of the crew. Scylla, in her own high-oxygen world, might have been a queen of kinetic speed. But here, the air was too thin, and she moved like a clockwork toy whose mainspring was slowly unwinding. At the cave's mouth, a jagged, yawning gap in the cliffside, Thorn stopped. He held out a hand for Lissa. She hissed, a dry, acoustic rattle. Her translator was gone, lost in the frantic retreat across the purple grass. He pointed at the bare patch of skin where the hardware should have been interfaced. "Offline?" Lissa's tail flicked, touching his hand with the coldness of a reptile. She pushed a high-resolution image into his brain, the device tumbling into the tall, toxic weeds. He sighed, a sound of ancient, generational weariness. "I need your sensor ray, Lissa. Something is breathing in there, and I need to know if it possesses sapience." She glided onto his shoulder, her mass of familiar pressure against his gear. They went into the dark. It was empty of thought, containing only the heavy, wet scent of animal musk and the slow, rhythmic smell of blood. They emerged minutes later, dragging the paralyzed bodies of 3 feline horrors. Thorn turned to the shivering crowd of academics. "Go inside. Don't look at the biological debris." The cave was a tomb of damp, prehistoric stone. Volok was the first to give voice to the structural rot in their morale. "I've read the briefings on this planet," he moaned, his voice echoing off the damp walls. "Tornadoes that can pluck the scales from your back. Earthquakes that will grind our skeletal structures to meal. We are statistically doomed." Kira, with Lissa coiled in her lap like a living scarf, tried to find a positive data point in the gloom. "We have the sleds. We have the solar arrays. We can build a fortification." "Build?" Volok shrieked, the sound bouncing off the wet stone like a ping-pong ball. "It will be 50 degrees Celsius in the sun. Scylla and I will be boiled in our own biological fluids." Kira stood up, her face a mask of sudden, sharp defiance, the kind of look that precedes a major scientific breakthrough or a suicide mission. "Then we dig. We find the thermal sink. We make what we need or we extract it from the planetary crust. I will not accept a terminal status for this mission. You have no mechanical engineers here. Volok spat. No master of gears. While you waste time playing at being a technician, the predators will come back for their habitat." Orion spoke up from the corner, his voice small but steady, backed by the confidence of someone who doesn't know enough to be terrified. "Thorn has the kinetic weapons. We have the sleds. We can think our way through the problem." "A sled is not a weapon of war." Volok turned on the boy, his finger stabbing the air like a needle. "We have a soldier, a handful of scholars, a botanist. And you? What is your specific craft? Boy, what is your function?" Orion looked at his boots. "I'm an intern," he whispered. "Intern?" Volok repeated a word as if it were a linguistic bug. In the Concord, one was born to a craft and performed it until biological termination. The idea of a half-formed thing, a creature in a state of professional transition, was a profound heresy to their orderly, pre-programmed minds. Thorn's voice boomed from the entrance, cutting through the social friction. He stood silhouetted against the dying light, the feline carcasses stacked behind him on a sled. The river is cold. I've left the protein there. Tomorrow we consume. Orion, take this. He tossed the stun gun to the boy. If it moves and doesn't initiate a handshake protocol, shoot it. If it doesn't speak, it's a food source. He handed him a jagged, multi-purpose knife. I'm not a combatant, Orion stammered, looking at the blade. Thorn smiled, a cold, hard line that suggested he was thinking about the history of warfare. You're a soldier now, boy. The curriculum has been updated. Welcome to the infantry. He turned to go. Think of a way to secure the perimeter. I'll be back when the primary moon reaches its zenith. Later, Thorn returned to a cave that hummed with a different frequency of energy. The crew was busy, their hands moving in the dim light of the portable lanterns with a focus that looked like actual productivity. But as he approached, a sudden, brittle silence descended. What is that biological entity? He asked, pointing at a scaly, four-legged thing that Kira was trying to hide behind her cloak. It looked like a dog that had been designed by a committee focused on long-necked reptiles. It followed us, she said, her voice a defensive trill. It has no local pack. Lissa says it's a non-hostile. It thinks we are the primary actors in its world. Thorn looked at Lissa, who was currently entwined with Volok in a heap of scales and synthetic fur. Is this a valid assessment, Lissa? Lissa hissed, a soft, neutral sound. And everyone is on board with this? You want to adopt a local predator? He looked at the Krillok and the Aurael. Lissa hissed again, this time with a sharp, affirmative edge that suggested the debate was over. Volok, weary of the interpersonal friction and charmed by the animal's behavior, simply nodded his heavy head. Thorn blew a long breath through his teeth. Fine. A mascot for the stranded. Orion, what's the status of the perimeter trap? Orion beamed, a flash of white teeth in the dark. Fully operational, Commander. He vanished toward the mouth of the cave with a bag of jury-rig components. In the final hour of light, they sat together, the rigid barriers of Concord rank and species beginning to erode like a beach in the storm. Kira and Lissa were a single entity of scales and low-frequency words. Their new pet, Xanthos, fell into a deep, twitching sleep on Kira's lap, while Lissa draped herself over Kira's shoulders like an expensive, telepathic stole. Orion, Volok asked, his voice now curious rather than antagonistic. Explain this intern concept. Thorn cut in, his voice a dry rasp from the shadows. Here's a lab rat. The Concord wanted to see how a standard-issue human breaks under different atmospheric and psychological pressures. Half the tasks he performed on the ship were actually puzzles designed by people like Lissa to see if he'd cry, quit, or conquer. Orion's jaw dropped. The betrayal was a physical, high-impact blow to his ego. He looked at Lissa, his eyes wide with realization. The puzzles? The unsolvable logic cubes? The recursive loops? I was a goddamn specimen. Lissa hissed. That's not a response. You're just saying the word hiss out loud. A ripple of laughter moved through the cave, a fragile, high-fidelity sound. It died instantly when a scream of pure, mechanical violence erupted from the entrance, the sound of organic matter being pulverized by a high-velocity, industrial-grade force. At the cave's mouth, they found a topological nightmare smeared across the stone. A feline predator, significantly larger than the previous specimens, had been turned into a fine red mist. Half of its mass was plastered to the ceiling. The other half was an unrecognizable organic pulp. Thorn turned to Orion, his face pale in the moonlight. What exactly did you deploy? Boy, did you find a tactical nuke in the inventory? Orion stood there, looking at the ceiling, a small, dark smile playing on his lips, the look of an engineer who has just discovered the joys of unregulated power. He looked at Volok. I told you. I successfully terminated a high-mass predator using a grav-sled. Volok could only gape. How? I stripped the safety protocols, Orion said, his voice quiet and chillingly logical. I flipped the sled over. I set the proximity sensors to trigger on any unregistered mass and instructed the engines to lift 1 metric ton to 8 meters instantaneously. No safety dampeners. No gradual ramp-up. The physics of the kill hit them all at once. The cat had stepped onto the inverted sled, and the machine had reacted with the violence of a localized explosion, punching the creature into the ceiling with the force of a 1,000-pound kinetic hammer. "It's all over the structural supports," Kira whispered, shielding Xantho from the data. What if the pet had stepped there? Thorn leaned against the cold stone and closed his eyes, contemplating the future of human-alien relations. Scylla, Grolek, and Vorlok stood in a circle of stunned, analytical silence. From the darkness, Lissa hissed, a long, slow sound that might have been a laugh or a high-level appreciation of a job well done.